Hello Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually began as a question from commenter Daryl Royer. And Daryl asked, in The Fellowship of the Ring, the book, at the end of chapter 5, Frodo has a dream about the sea and admits that it, quote, often troubled his dreams. Is this Ulmo? Not knowing the answer, I did some research. And what I found was so surprising and fascinating that I thought it deserved more than just a few lines in a comment section. I learned something new, so I wanted to share that with you. So, let's get right to it. For starters, let me read to you Frodo's cryptic dream in The Fellowship of the Ring. If you remember, Frodo pretends to be moving from Bag End to Crick Hollow as an excuse to surreptitiously leave town. He has this dream on the night that he arrives at Crick Hollow. So this is from Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 5, A Conspiracy Unmasked. When at last he had got to bed, Frodo could not sleep for some time. His legs ached. He was glad that he was riding in the morning. Eventually, he fell into a vague dream in which he seemed to be looking out of a high window over a dark sea of tangled trees. Down below among the roots, there was a sound of creatures crawling and snuffling. He felt sure they would smell him out sooner or later. Then he heard a noise in the distance. At first, he thought it was a great wind coming over the leaves of the forest. Then he knew it was not leaves, but the sound of the sea far off. A sound he had never heard in waking life, though it had often troubled his dreams. Suddenly, he found he was out in the open. There were no trees after all. He was on a dark heath, and there was a strange salt smell in the air. Looking up, he saw before him a tall white tower, standing alone on a high ridge. A great desire came over him to climb the tower and see the sea. He started to struggle up the ridge towards the tower, but suddenly a light came in the sky, and there was a noise of thunder. So that's the dream. A tall white tower near the sea, a different high window overlooking a forest. It's all quite mysterious. And when I researched it, I found out part of the reason why it's so mysterious. To add my own level of mystery, we definitively know what the dream meant, but we have to guess at what the dream means. And what I mean by that is, this dream is a remnant of an early draft of the Fellowship of the Ring. At the time, it fit the plot more precisely. Hence, we know what it meant, which I'll explain in a moment. But the fact that it was left in the story after the plot was changed makes it enigmatic. An example of this is the character Trotter, whom I did a video about if you're interested. But in short, Trotter was in the early drafts of the Fellowship, later to be replaced by Strider. Unlike Strider, Trotter was essentially a hobbit ranger who wore wooden shoes, hence the nickname due to the clip-clop of the wood, Trotter. His backstory, however, is that he doesn't have wooden shoes, he has wooden feet, because his feet were cut off by the Nazgul while he was being tortured in Moria, which just sounds brutal. Okay, anyway, that underwent a major rewrite, obviously, but there are some artifacts from those early Trotter drafts in the published version of Fellowship of the Ring. For instance, when the Fellowship is debating whether to enter Moria, we hear this. "I too once passed the Dimril Gate," said Aragorn quietly. "But though I also came out again, the memory is very evil. I do not wish to enter Moria a second time." Now, we're never told about Aragorn's first visit to Moria. And I think the reason is that that's Trotter's memory. Trotter would remember having his feet cut off the last time he was in Khazad-dûm. Also, we get a very odd reaction from Aragorn when he hears the Nazgul in Bree. This is from Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 10, Strider. "You may escape from Bree and be allowed to go forward while the sun is up, but you won't go far. They will come on you in the wild, in some dark place where there is no help. Do you wish them to find you? They are terrible." The hobbits looked at him and saw with surprise that his face was drawn as if with pain, and his hands clenched the arms of his chair. For a while he sat with unseeing eyes, as if walking in distant memory, or listening to sounds in the night far away. Aragorn is terrified, hands clenching the arms of his chair, which seems a bit out of character for Strider, but not for Trotter, who had PTSD from being tortured by the Nazgul. All that is to say that there are some residual passages from early drafts that stayed in the story and added a layer of mystery. So what about Frodo's dream? All right, let's start with what it originally meant. And for that, we go to the history of Middle-earth, more specifically, the Treason of Isengard, the Fourth Phase, which features detailed notes from Tolkien's early drafts. And here we're going to see a longer, more cinematic version of the dream. This quote leads off with some comments from Christopher Tolkien. "It is necessary here to bring in a remarkable brief narrative of this time, which may be called the Dream of the Tower. In the narrative outline dated autumn 1939, Gandalf is besieged in the Western Tower. He cannot get away while they guard it with 5 riders. But when Black Riders have located Frodo and found that he has gone off without Gandalf, they ride away. This is what Frodo saw in his dream. For some reason, however, my father decided to place it when Frodo was at Bree and Gandalf was at Crick Hollow. The text of Frodo's dream begins with Frodo waking suddenly in the room at the Prancing Pony, seeing Trotter, sitting alert in his chair and falling asleep again. Frodo soon went to sleep again, but now he passed at once into a dream. He found himself on a dark heath. Looking up, he saw before him a tall white tower, standing alone upon a high ridge." This all sounds familiar. "Beyond it, the sky was pale, and far off there came a murmur like the voices of the great sea, which he had never heard or beheld, save in other dreams. In the topmost chamber of the tower there shone dimly a blue light. Suddenly he found that he had drawn near, and the tower loomed high above him. About its feet there was a wall of faintly shining stones, and outside the wall sat silent watchers, black-robed figures on black horses, gazing at the gate of the tower without moving, as if they had sat there forever. There came at last the soft fall of hoofs climbing up the hill. The watchers all stirred and turned slowly towards the sound. They were looking towards Frodo. He did not dare to turn, but he knew that behind him another dark figure, taller and more terrible, had appeared. Probably the Witch King. It beckoned and called out in a strange tongue. The horsemen leaped to life. They raised their dark heads towards the lofty chamber, and their mocking laughter rang out cruel and cold. Then they turned from the white wall and rode down the hill like the wind. The blue light went out. It seemed to Frodo that the riders came straight towards him, but even as they passed over him and beat him to the ground, he thought in his heart, "I'm not here. They cannot hurt me. There is something that I must see." He lifted his head and saw a white horse leap the wall and stride towards him. On it rode a gray-mantled figure. His white hair was streaming, and his cloak flew like wings behind him. As the gray rider bore down upon him, he strove to see his face. The light grew in the sky, and suddenly there was the noise of thunder. Frodo opened his eyes. Trotter had drawn the curtains and had pushed back the shutters with a clang. The first gray light of day was in the room. The vision of his dream faded quickly, but its mingled fear and hope remained with him all the day. And for long the far sound of the sea came back to him whenever great danger was at hand. So we get a much more vivid dream, right? I mean, we get Nazgul, we get Gandalf in the tower, Gandalf riding his horse, probably Shadowfax. I love that Frodo's in the middle of the action, watching the riders race past him. This dream is about Gandalf's imprisonment, but it comes before Tolkien added Saruman and Isengard. So in this draft, instead of Orthanc, Gandalf is imprisoned by the Nazgul in the Western Tower, aka the White Tower. This is the Tower of Elostirion in the Tower Hills. It's west of the Shire and very near to the Grey Havens. There are 3 White Towers located there, and Elostirion is the tallest. And we learn that there's a Palantir housed in Elostirion, known as the Elendil Stone, and it gazes west across the sea. So the Nazgul have cornered Gandalf here in the tower, but when they learn that Frodo's on the move with the ring, they ride away, allowing Gandalf to escape. Here's more from the Treason of Isengard. And so, the tall white tower of Frodo's dream at Crick Hollow in the final tale remains from what was the precursor of Orthanc. And the thunder that he heard goes back to the interruption of his dream by trotters thrusting back the shutters at the prancing pony. But Frodo would still dream of Gandalf imprisoned in a tower, for as he slept in the house of Tom Bombadil, he would see him standing on the pinnacle of Isengard. And that's true. There's a completely separate dream in the published version of the Fellowship of the Ring that Frodo has shortly after this one. And in that dream, he envisions Gwaihir's rescue of Gandalf from the top of Orthanc. So it's interesting that Tolkien kept the original dream of Gandalf's imprisonment in the White Tower and added a dream of Gandalf's imprisonment at Isengard. Hence my earlier comment that we know what the White Tower dream meant in early drafts, but not definitively what it means in the final published work. I don't think Tolkien left the dream in accidentally. Let's put it that way. Also, there's an interesting comment in that last quote about the end of Frodo's dream. But suddenly a light came in the sky, and there was a noise of thunder. In the early drafts, that was his mind interpreting Trotter noisily opening the shutters at the prancing pony. In the published version, they're at Crick Hollow, remember. But there is a similar cause. Frodo's dream ends chapter 5. Chapter 6 begins with this. Frodo woke suddenly. It was still dark in the room. Merry was standing there with a candle in one hand and banging on the door with the other. "All right, what is it?" said Frodo, still shaken and bewildered. "What is it?" cried Merry. "It's time to get up. It's 4:30 and very foggy. Come on, Sam is already getting breakfast ready." So Trotter and the shutters is replaced by Merry banging on the door and holding a candle. And that's the inspiration for, but suddenly a light came in the sky and there was the noise of thunder. So we know what it originally meant. But what does the White Tower dream mean in the final work? Could that tower now refer to Minas Tirith or Minas Ithil? I don't think so. I think it's still Elostirion, mainly because of its proximity to the sea. And though it doesn't play a prominent role in The Lord of the Rings, it is mentioned a few chapters before Frodo's dream. Sam talks about it in chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. "And I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they are going to the harbors, out away beyond the white towers." Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire. But it was an old tradition that away over there stood the Grey Havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. "They are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us," said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly. So at least the White Towers are name-dropped before they show up in Frodo's dream. And I think the connection to the elves is important. Frodo, Sam, and Pippin meet up with Gildor. I've done a video on Gildor if you want to check that out. But Gildor and a group of elves shortly before arriving at Crick Hollow and the dream. And Gildor's arrival scares off a black rider. I'm going to read that passage and note some similarities to Frodo's dream. Notably, Frodo's dream includes creatures crawling and snuffling. Here's the quote from the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 3. 3 is company. The hoofs drew nearer. They had no time to find any hiding place better than the general darkness under the trees. Sam and Pippin crouched behind a large tree bole, while Frodo crept back a few yards towards the lane. The sound of hooves stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between two trees, and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse, led by a smaller black shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground, and then began to crawl towards him. Once more the desire to slip on the ring came over Frodo, but this time it was stronger than before, so strong that almost before he realized what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. But at that moment, there came a sound like mingled song and laughter. Clear voices rose and fell in the starlit air. The black shadow straightened up and retreated. It climbed onto the shadowy horse and seemed to vanish across the lane into the darkness on the other side. Frodo breathed again. "Elves!" exclaimed Sam in a hoarse whisper. "Elves, sir!" He would have burst out of the trees and dashed off towards the voices if they had not pulled him back. "Yes, it is elves," said Frodo. "One can meet them sometimes in the woody end. They don't live in the Shire, but they wander into it in spring and autumn, out of their own lands, away beyond the Tower Hills. I am thankful that they do. You did not see, but that black rider stopped just here and was actually crawling towards us when the song began. As soon as he heard the voices, he slipped away." So it seems obvious that the crawling, snuffling creatures in Frodo's dream are the Black Riders, much like they appeared in the early draft of the dream. And note that Frodo mentions the White Towers again. In fact, Gildor and his company of elves are returning to Rivendell from visiting the towers. They made a pilgrimage to Elistirion to gaze into the Palantir housed there, look west across the sea, and perhaps catch a glimpse of Elbereth, Varda, the Vala most revered by the elves, the Queen of the Stars. Hence, I think the portion of Frodo's dream that reads, "A great desire came over him to climb the tower and see the sea," is a reference to Gildor and the elves. The point of Gildor's journey was to climb the tower and see across the sea. So, if you take the dream imagery of the crawling, snuffling creatures in the tangle of trees, Nazgul in the forest, and the urge to climb Elistirion, I think the dream represents Frodo's mind revisiting and trying to cope with the amazing, heart-pounding events of the past few days. So it's looking back. There's a theory that the dream is a premonition, looking forward, perhaps foreshadowing Frodo's journey west at the end of the trilogy. And it may be that, connecting Frodo to the sea. But there is another dream that Frodo has shortly after this one, when he's with Tom Bombadil in the Old Forest, and that more clearly predicts his journey west. This is from Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 8, Fog on the Barrow Downs. That night they heard no noises, but either in his dreams or out of them, he could not tell which, Frodo heard a sweet singing running in his mind, a song that seemed to come like a pale light behind a gray rain curtain, and growing stronger to turn the veil all to glass and silver, until at last it was rolled back, and a far green country opened before him under a swift sunrise. The vision melted into waking, and there was Tom whistling like a tree full of birds, and the sun was already slanting down the hill and through the open window. If that text sounds familiar, it's the source of Gandalf's description of the Undying Lands to Pippin in the film version of The Return of the King. So that dream is unquestionably about journeying west. And it comes just a few days after Crick Hollow. Is it possible that both dreams are premonitions about journeying west? Sure. But it does feel redundant if that's the case, which is why I lean towards the interpretation that the White Tower dream is looking back instead of looking forward. It is possible that this dream is actually a different kind of premonition. Now, I don't think what I'm about to suggest is likely, but I do think it's worth mentioning. I'm going to read you a quote from the Council of Elrond that happens about 1 month after Frodo's dream at Crickhollow. The main speaker in this quote is Galdor, and he's an elf representing the Grey Havens. The first speaker is Gandalf. "We should seek a final end of this menace, even if we do not hope to make one. And that we shall not find on the roads to the sea," said Galdor. "If the return to Yarwain," that's the elven name for Tom Bombadil, "be thought too dangerous, then flight to the sea is now fraught with gravest peril. My heart tells me that Sauron will expect us to take the western way when he learns what has befallen. He soon will. Only the waning might of Gondor stands now between him and a march in power along the coasts into the north. And if he comes, assailing the White Towers and the Havens, hereafter the elves may have no escape from the lengthening shadows of Middle-earth." So Galdor is replying to Glorfindel in that quote, who has suggested throwing the ring into the sea. Galdor says that Sauron is going to expect that strategy and will march on the White Towers and the Havens. So perhaps Frodo's dream, while in possession of the ring, is a premonition of that outcome. Being chased by the Nazgul until there's nowhere left to go but to climb the White Tower, as Gandalf did in the early drafts, besieged by the enemy. It's a reach, but possible. So we've talked about the possible interpretations of most of the dream imagery, and that just leaves the lines mentioned by our commenter, Daryl. "Then he knew that it was not leaves, but the sound of the sea far off, a sound he had never heard in waking life, though it had often troubled his dreams." And Daryl is right. This is the most intriguing line of the dream. Even though he's never heard the sea in real life, he's often hearing it and identifying it in his dreams. Daryl asks, is this Ulmo? And that's a reasonable guess. Ulmo is much like Poseidon in Tolkien's mythology, Lord of Waters. And he's known to appear to men and elves to help guide them. Notably, he appeared to the mortal hero, Tuor, in the First Age. He guides Tuor to Gondolin, where he meets the king's daughter, Idril, and they have a son, Eärendil, Elrond's dad, who basically saves Middle-earth at the end of the First Age. Daryl is suggesting that Ulmo is reaching out to Frodo to aid him in saving Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age. And the language of Tuor's meeting with Ulmo shares some similarities to Frodo's dream. This quote is from the Silmarillion, chapter 23, and it mentions Vinyamar. Vinyamar was a beautiful coastal city built by the Noldor elves and then abandoned. And I think it's fair to say there were towers in Vinyamar. "And Tuor came into Neverast, and looking upon the great sea, he was enamored of it, and the sound of it and the longing for it were ever in his heart and ear. But when the autumn came, he saw 7 great swans flying south, and he knew them for a sign that he had tarried overlong. Thus he came at length to the deserted halls of Vinyamar beneath Mount Taras. And there came a great storm out of the west. And out of that storm Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, arose in majesty and spoke to Tuor as he stood beside the sea. And Ulmo bade him depart from that place and seek out the hidden kingdom of Gondolin." So, like Frodo's dream, Tuor is enamored by the sound of the sea. And as he journeys along the coast, he comes to the halls of Vinyamar, and Ulmo arrives on a storm. Remember, Frodo's dream ends with, "And there was the noise of thunder." Maybe this dream was an invitation from Ulmo to come to the White Towers and the sea, which is something Frodo's never done, in order to receive guidance from Ulmo. It's possible. It doesn't seem to come up too much, but perhaps it's enough that Ulmo is able to visit Frodo in his dreams and provide some form of comfort. Though note that Tolkien uses the phrase, "it had often troubled his dreams." Troubled. Which makes me think of something that's not welcome. And that leads to a different possible interpretation. Frodo's never been to the sea, but the sound of it often troubles his dreams. Why? The answer might lie in the fact that Frodo's parents drowned when he was 12. They drowned in the Brandywine River, which leads all the way to the sea. Perhaps his dreaming mind created a sound to associate with the loss of his parents, the sound of waves. So maybe this dream about the White Tower and gazing at the sea also reminded him of the tragedy of his parents. Just a thought. But thank you, Daryl, for that incredibly thought-provoking question. I like your Ulmo theory. I mean, it sounds like something Tolkien would enjoy including in this ambiguous dream imagery. But I take this to the viewers. What are your interpretations of Frodo's White Tower dream? Put your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to read them. And thanks again. I'll see you next time, everybody.